We're back. I'm Dave Donaldson. Welcome back to Grip Tips. In the next couple of episodes, I'm going to be teaching you guys a couple of things that you should know before ever stepping foot on a film set, starting with the most important part of the day, lunch. Now, why are we doing lunches? Because there's a couple of different terms regarding lunch that may or may not increase your paycheck. Now, while I know most of you typically only watch about half to 3/4 of one of my episodes if I'm like reviewing lights. But this one I recommend sticking out all the way until the end because, as I just said, there are a couple of different terms that, again, might add more to your paycheck. And not knowing these terms means that production can take advantage of you and not pay you what you deserve. So today we'll be talking about catering, last man, grace periods, meal penalties, and NDBs. Now I'm going to break this down both in the non-union world and in the union world, as the pay kind of differs from either, but both the non-union and union both have the same #1 rule, which is production must feed you 6 hours after your call time. Not crew call, your call time. So in the sense of a 6 a.m. call time, production now has to feed you 6 hours later, so noon. So in addition to the 6-hour rule, there's also something called last man. And basically what that means is the last man has gone through the catering line. The reason for this is that, say you have a crew of 50 to 60 people, well, the people that are in the front of that line, they're going to be able to sit and enjoy their lunch a lot longer than the people in the back of the line, which is unfair to them. So what production does is they wait for the very last person to make their way through the lunch line, and once that person has food in their hands, they'll call last man, which basically means lunch starts now. Along with last man, there are things that delay last man. For example, they call lunch and you then have to be shuttled from set over to catering. This is more of the employer control because you had no direct control as to how to get to lunch. Now, another good example of employer control when it comes to interrupting last man is when the actors have to cut the catering line. The reason for this is that the actors have to be called at a moment's notice. They always have to be going through hair and makeup before they can actually be camera ready. So shoving them through the catering line so that they can enjoy their lunch and then be sent to hair, makeup, wardrobe, whatever it is that they have to do so that they're ready to go to set. Don't take offense to it. When they cut the line, they're fine. It's fine. We're all fine now. Thank you. How are you? So those are a couple of examples of employer control and the definition of last man. And how that can interrupt it. Now let's talk catering. Now, generally speaking, whether you're on a non-union show or a union show, lunches can be a half an hour or an hour. It's really kind of up to production at that point. But something important to note is that if you are only going to get a half an hour lunch, production has to provide catering. However, and this is more in the talks of union, if you're in the union and you're working on a backlot like Fox, Universal, Warner, and there's a 1-hour walkaway lunch, production doesn't need to provide you lunch. Now, why is that? Those studios, like I just mentioned, on the backlot, they actually do have a commissary. And even at Warner Brothers, they have a couple of restaurants that are actually sprinkled throughout the backlot. So production's not required to give you a meal if it's a 1-hour walkaway. However, if you are in the union and you're working in a really remote place like Disney Ranch, for those of you who've never seen Disney Ranch, just imagine the sticks where production, if they call a 1-hour walkaway, they still need to provide you a meal because it's kind of impossible to pull off. Think about it this way. If you're shooting in the sticks somewhere, chances are your car is parked at a parking lot somewhere. The shuttle has taken you 5-10 minutes down the road to set, then you go to set, and then now production needs to reverse that in order for you to walk away. So then that would mean they have to shuttle you back to your cars, and then you in your car have to then drive, a days east to the nearest Applebee's to then have lunch, come back, park your car, get in the shuttle, to be brought back to set. It's just a logistical nightmare. So in situations like that, if you're union and you're working in the sticks and there's a 1-hour walkaway, production still needs to provide you a meal. So the two main takeaways is that A, if it's a half an hour lunch, production has to provide a meal. And B, if it's a logistical nightmare, like I just mentioned, they have to provide a meal. So that's catering and when it's provided and when it's not. Now let's talk about meal penalties. Now remember what I said earlier in the episode is that production needs to break you for lunch 6 hours after your call time. So in the case of 6 a.m., that would be noon, right? But what if they don't and the clock hits 12:01? They're getting hit with a meal penalty. So first I just want to break this down in the non-union world. So let's just say hypothetically you negotiated 500 for 12. If production hits a meal penalty, then you are going to charge them 1 times your hourly rate. Production now owes you an additional $35.71 because that's your hourly rate. And before Before a bunch of people decide to break out a calculator and go 3571 times 12 to not get 500, you're not accounting for time and a half. And I may show that math and how it's broken down in a future episode, but for now, just trust me, it's 3571. So in the case of that, you are now charging production, your gross is now $535.71. So that's the non-union side. Let's talk about the union side. Things are a little bit different. There's still the same rule that we learned in the beginning of this episode, which is the 6-hour period. They have to feed you at that 6-hour mark. But the difference is that meal penalties can accrue every half an hour after until you're fed. So here's what that looks like. 6 a.m. to noon, no meal penalty. 6 a.m. to 12:01, 1 meal penalty because they're over by a minute. 6 a.m. to 12:31, 2 meal penalties because they happen every half an hour. 6 a.m. to 1:01 p.m., 3 meal penalties, and so on and so forth every half an hour. Now the rate of pay is completely different from the non-union world, as it's not 1 times your hourly rate of pay. A matter of fact, these numbers kind of change all the time depending on the project's contract. And also those numbers change depending on how many actual meal penalties you've had in a week. So in this example that I'm about to show you, don't really pay attention to the numbers because they change all the time. But let's just say that you had 3 meal penalties in a day. This is what that would look like. Let's take our worst case scenario, 6 a.m. to 1:01 example. The first meal penalty is, say, $7.50, the second is $10, the third is $12.50, adding $30 to your paycheck. These numbers could also be $8.50, $11, $13.50, giving you $33 on your paycheck. Again, these rates change all the time. I think I've beat that to death now. But the other way that they can also change is how many meal penalties that you've had in that week. For example, if you have 20 meal penalties in a week in the union, now every meal penalty after is now 1 times your hourly rate, much like the non-union side, except it happens every half an hour. Kind of a crazy concept, but last year I actually got up to 19 meal penalties in a week. So it's rare, but it does happen. So that's meal penalties both in the union world and in the non-union world. Now let's move on to something called grace. So here's how grace works. Let's say call time is 6 a.m. and it's now 11:55 a.m. later in the day. Production is now in a position where they've been doing the same take over and over again. It's the last portion of, let's just say if we were shooting in here, but we keep doing takes over and over again. Production has the ability to call grace, which means that they're going to roll through all the walkie channels and they're going to say, hey guys, we're going into grace. Now, what does that mean? In a nutshell, it basically means that we're going to give production an additional 12 minutes after the lunch hour mark. Yes, 12 minutes because we work in clicks, and so that's 2 clicks for that 12-minute period to complete the shot so that we can move on to something completely different after lunch. So on our time cards, yeah, we'll write 12.2 for those 2 clicks, but accounting's going to look at the production report and realize that we went into grace, and then we're not going to charge them a meal penalty for that 12-minute period. It's just supposed to be a tool so that production doesn't get penalized. Now, I've had an AC and an editor tell me this, but they were both kind of young. I mean, I'm young, but they were younger. And they kind of told me that grace also somehow helped the post-production world back in the film days where people were still actually editing film. And the reason for this is that if they called grace, they got their shot in that 12-minute period, they would roll out the rest of the film so that it wasn't confusing to editors in post. Which I think makes a lot of sense, because let's say hypothetically you're shooting on a beach all day, and then suddenly in post-production it goes from a beach to an interior of a house. It just, like, as an editor you'd be like, what the hell? Again though, I have no way to really confirm this, so I'm hoping that maybe there's like an old school film editor out there who can chime in about that, because I'm really curious if that's the history or not. However, because we live more in the digital age with like SD cards and red mags and etc., grace is more about making the day. Now, what happens if production violates grace? Well, they're hit with a meal penalty. And in the union world, they only have another 18 minutes left before they're hit with another one. Also, grace periods, and this is literally written within Local 80's basic agreement contract, verbatim, such grace period shall not be scheduled, nor automatic, nor is it intended for everyday use. So what does that mean? They can't schedule it. So they can't write it on a call sheet. They can't, write it down preemptively like, oh, on this day, we're going to go ahead and call grace. That's not allowed. And then the second thing is that they can't just assume that the entire crew knows that they're in a grace period or call it within that 12-minute 2-click mark. So they're not allowed to do that either. And then thirdly, they're not supposed to use it every day. In fact, and this is something that I literally just learned 2 days ago, for all you local peeps out there in the union, if there's grace called more than twice a week, you're technically supposed to call your union hall and report it. So moving right along, kudos if you're still with me, but we still have one more thing to unpack, and that is the super confusing non-deductible break. So now this is another tool that production can use to help a department get aligned with the rest of the crew at crew call. Let's just say hypothetically in the case of Grip and Electric, they need to be there a half an hour before crew call to build 4 20-bys or car rigging, or for the electricians, maybe you got to run, you know, a bunch of sticks of 4/0, I don't know. It could be a multitude of different asks. Production has 2 options. They can either pre-call the department to come in, but they then risk, you know, meal penalties earlier than the rest of the crew later in the day, or they can use a non-deductible break with that department. So let's utilize our 6 a.m. call time again to see how we can effectively use an NDB. You can only use an NDB an hour before or an hour after crew call. So in the case of 6 a.m., that's anywhere between 5 a.m. and 7 a.m., but nowhere outside of that range. If we do before 6 a.m. and we need those 20-bys built before crew call, that department will come to work, and in the first half an hour of the day, they will be paid on the clock to sit and eat breakfast. As the term suggests, non-deductible break. So in the beginning of that day from 5 a.m. to 5:30, you're supposed to be seated eating uninterrupted. So if somebody comes up to you and starts talking to you about something that they need rigged for anything, you can kind of politely tell them to F off, because that's your non-deductible break period. I suppose if you don't want to butt heads, yeah, you could probably talk shop with them while you're eating, but you should never have to be forced to, if that makes sense. So the power of the NDB is in your court at that point, because again, you're supposed to be seated, eating. There's other rules within the union, like shaded and in a well-ventilated area, et cetera, et cetera. So now after that period, 5:30 hits, you and your crew are building those 20-bys or the car rigging or whatever the ask was. And then when 6 o'clock hits, the rest of the crew call comes in, and now that department is ready for the rest of the crew to then align with their normal workflow. So there's other stipulations to the NDB, which is that department can work for 6.5 hours straight, and they also sacrifice the first meal penalty because that's the trade-off. You were paid to sit and eat in the beginning of the day. So in the case of our example, 5 a.m. to 11:30 a.m., that's 6.5 hours later, and you'd think that'd be where you'd end up charging them a meal penalty, but because you sacrificed that one, and meal penalties within the union happen every half an hour, that ends up lining up with the rest of the crew at crew call of 6 a.m. at 12:01. This is kind of a big deal for me because I've been screwed on this quite a few times earlier in my career not knowing this information. As a matter of fact, one of the times, the very first time I can remember, somebody gave me a breakfast burrito and I was like working while eating. But later on when I turned in my time card, they saw that I had wrote meal penalty and they said, no, we gave you a breakfast burrito, that's an NDB. So I went for a few years thinking that that's how it's done, and then found out, you know, I think, what, 5 years ago, that's not how it works. And I really didn't even fully understand the NDB until last year, but that's because I've been in the union for 2 years. So there's that. Also, and this is probably more on a best boy level, some best boy advice, but you'd actually be kind of surprised how many assistant directors will ask you if you can do an NDB a half an hour before crew call. That makes no sense, because the first thing that the crew is doing when they first show up to work is they're being paid to sit and eat for that first half an hour. So nothing gets done, and then you have crew call. That's kind of a total fail. The other thing that I've noticed that some other assistant directors have done is asked if you can do it sometime in the second hour period, you know, between 6 a.m. and 7 a.m. That kind of doesn't work either, because anybody who's ever set foot on a set can tell you that the first half an hour to 45 minutes of the day are usually the most hectic, because production is in full swing. There's no time for any crew member to just take their tool belt off and go sit down and eat for a half an hour. So that kind of also doesn't work. I'd actually really like to know how that got formed, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But yeah, so that's just kind of some personal advice from me to you, I guess, as a best boy, is that NDBs only kind of make sense when you do it an hour before crew call. So if you made it this far, I applaud you. That is a lot of information. Now you know the magic that goes behind lunch, all the terminology to make sure that your paycheck is protected, and all the other terminology to help production look good. So I definitely applaud you if you've made it this far. But sadly, that is all that I have for you guys today. If you liked today's episode, please let me know in the comment section below. You could also follow me on my Instagram right here. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.